Well, I was going to say good morning, but it is afternoon, 1 minute after. Thank you all for being here. Today, we're going to go over the study that was funded through the Appalachian Region Commission, City of Dunkirk, the Northern Chautauqua Community Foundation, and the County of Chautauqua Industrial Development Agency on the NRG feasibility study and alternative analysis. We have two speakers, Rebecca Worster. And Rebecca is a special project coordinator with the Department of Planning and Development and the Chautauqua County Partnership for Economic Growth under the umbrella of the Chautauqua Region Economic Development Corporation. Vince DeJoy was appointed as the Director of Planning and Development for the City of Dunkirk in November of 2021. And those are their roles, and they'll go a lot into detail about their roles in this particular study. So we will, if you have a question, you can, because there are only about 20 so people here, you can raise your hand. I don't know. I think most people know you can go into reactions, and if you go into reactions at the bottom of the page, you can raise your hand. And as you see, I raise my hand and I go in the top of the list here. So, so I can tell if you have a question. You can also put your questions in the chat and I will, ask the questions if they're in the chat. So
can we just go like this? Can we go like this, Mary?
You can go like that too, but you don't come to the, it's easier if you don't know how to use that, you can use that or put it in the chat. We'll give you 3 ways. Some people are more expertise at this than others. So if everybody would mute and we can start with the presentation.
Mary, just before we start, I just wanted to recognize Mayor Rosas is also with Vince today.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks for coming.
I guess I don't have to do introductions. He's the mayor of Dunkirk. Thanks.
All right, Mayor, did you want to say a few words before I get started?
No, no, I just want to say thank you to for organizing the presentation today, and if you have any questions that I can answer, feel free to ask. Thank you.
All right, with that said, I'll share my screen, and like Vince stated earlier, I'm going to present, but Vince is going to jump in and add some good commentary, and we'll go through the presentation. Like Mary said, if you have a question, please let me know. It might be easier to hold off on questions till the end of the presentation, but if I see someone raise their hand, no worries, we'll get to your question. Can everyone see that all right? Okay, just want to make sure I can change. Okay. So as Mary stated, today we're going to be talking about the study that was completed in June of 2021, the NRG Redevelopment Alternatives and Feasibility Study, Phase 1. And then we'll also talk about kind of a Phase 2 component. And right before I start, I just wanted to kind of let you know that Phase 1 was kind of a high level study looking at, 100 feet out, what are the current conditions, what kind of alternatives and possibilities could there be for the NRG sites and reuse of the site. And then Phase 2 is really getting a deeper dive into the actual sites. And I'll talk about that a little further down the line, but I just wanted to give you that context that Phase 1 is kind of a higher level study. So an overview, we'll look at the study, the Phase 1 study, and look at key findings, alternatives evaluated, preferred reuse alternatives, the phase 2 study, and next steps. So a study overview of the phase 1 study. We had, like Mary Say did, the City of Dunkirk received a grant through the Appalachian Regional Commission in 2018 through the Power Initiative that is specific to coal impacted communities, and you could apply for funding for planning studies or implementation projects for capital projects. So the city at the time, when I was in my position, we thought, let's be proactive. NRG needs to be a part of this process, but we can't sit around and wait for NRG to move forward with their plans. We need to be proactive in our approach. So we partnered with the county to put in this application and receive grant funding. So some of our project team included the Industrial Development Agency, our steering committee, which also included Chautauqua County positions, our U.S. Congressman Tom Reed's office, the state Senate at the 57th District. We included Phillips Lytle attorneys and economic development consultants. And then we also had our consultants, Bergman, MRB Group, who looked at the marketing side of the piece and kind of the development of that. The Brownfield Group, because it is a brownfield parcel, and Empire Building Diagnostics to look at the costs for demolition and rehabilitation of the site. So as you know, the project site, you all know where that's included, but it's approximately 76 acres and located obviously on Dunkirk's waterfront. The entire site, it's important to note that 76 acres of the site is NRG's parcel, but there is a small parcel within the middle of the site that is National Grid's electrical switchyard. And they've recently made some major improvements to that switchyard. And that's really important to note because that switchyard isn't going anywhere anytime soon. So any redevelopment thoughts of the site have to take into account that National Grid switchyard, which is smack dab in the middle of the site. We also note that there's rail and interstates not too far, as well as water transportation options. So looking at the current conditions and what infrastructure is surrounding. We also wanted to look at background studies and assessments before we moved forward with any alternative reuse analysis. So we looked at the socioeconomic profile and trends of the area, of the region, of the city, market analysis, looking at real estate market and site reuse feasibility. We did a high-level phase 1 environmental site assessment of the materials that we could, that were public knowledge. NRG made available what was publicly allowed to be made available. So there are some gaps in that environmental site assessment, but it was really important to make sure we got as much information as we could to inform what the current conditions on the site were. And then demolition and abatement costs and case studies of other power plant facilities and their reuses. And that really helped us inform our alternatives analysis. So what are the project needs and objectives? Identifying a series of reuse options for the NRG site was one of the main goals. To support community revitalization efforts, promote workforce development opportunities, and include renewable energy components at the site. Ultimately, we need to be working with the state to fund any type of redevelopment at the site and making sure that we have different reuses that include renewable energy components that the state is really pushing right now is really important in thinking about the reuse. So in addition, we really wanted to take into account community revitalization, all the great work that the city has been doing as far as Dunkirk's waterfront and downtown and really trying to revitalize Dunkirk. And the closure of the NRG Power Plant directly and indirectly impacted the community and those ongoing revitalization efforts, especially in regards to the city's tax revenue stream, the jobs that were lost, workforce development, and then also rethinking how waterfront access and recreation could fit into the reuse of the site as well. And you can see it's important to note, Dunkirk's population trends. There's projected that, right now we'll be staying at a steady rate, but ultimately you have to take into that account as well. And in addition, the medium household incomes. So key findings. Like I mentioned, we did a phase 1 environmental site assessment. And that's really, really important because we needed to understand what type of contamination might be at the site. So the phase 1 environmental site assessment, with the information that was provided, gave us better insight on potential on-site surface and subsurface and groundwater contamination. It also gave us information on potential asbestos, lead containing materials, and PCB materials on site and within the buildings, the presence of active and inactive underground and above ground storage tanks, and the presence of coal ash lagoons on the site. So that's really important. I'll talk a little more about that, but that really helped us kind of take off some of the potential reuse alternatives, such as a clean slate option for parks, housing, and mixed use development, because it is tough to develop on a contaminated site, that kind of housing or mixed use development. And in addition, we really wanted to understand the cost estimates associated with a clean slate and what that might look like. Right here, I have it stated that kind of total demo costs are $12 million, and then total abatement costs, which would be like structure asbestos abatement, would be roughly $6 million. But also, in addition to that, which I apologize I didn't put on the slide, but base site remediation work, we also got an estimate, and that was $20 million. Oh, I do have that. So in total, we're looking for a clean slate to have the site totally cleaned up and developable, would be looking at $38 million. And that's just an approximate number. There could be more uncovered when you go to remediate the sites or clean up the site. So our estimate is $38 million. Market analysis, as I mentioned, was a really important part of the study and kind of leading to a preferred reuse alternative as well. So we looked at the opportunity to introduce additional industry and manufacturing businesses to Chautauqua County and the City of Dunkirk. The redevelopment of the site will really require some strong perspectives for leasing and will likely involve the build to suit component of construction. And then there's opportunities for funding resources through the opportunity zone status, which improves the site's competitiveness for investment and redevelopment. It's also a brownfield site, which is within the City of Dunkirk's BOA plan, which is really important. That gives some incentive for developers to redevelop the site. And then looking at some market analysis and industrial real estate summaries, kind of the current inventory, vacancy rates, market rents, and different results such as that. So ultimately, we did this background work first before we dived into the potential reuse alternatives. And what that showed us is the opportunities and constraints at the site. So for opportunities, we identified that access to the CSX rail and New York State interstate is really a great opportunity for redevelopment. Harbor and barge access offers some potential for redevelopment of the site. Proximity to large distribution markets such as Buffalo, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, Canada, are some great opportunities. There's a lot of redevelopment incentives out there as far as the brownfields and opportunity zone credits that are available. But in addition, working with the states and the different state agencies, there might be incentives as well, depending on what we decide for reuse of the site. And then potential to adaptively reuse the existing structures. You know, these structures have great bones. They have really well held up buildings. So is there a possibility for adaptive reuse? And then the long-term potential to align site reuse with the landfill site, which I'll talk about further down the line, about 5 miles down the road in the town of Pomfret. NRG does have a fly ash landfill site that could have potential for some opportunities there for redevelopment. And then constraints. Again, National Grid switchyard located in the center of the site isn't the best location for redevelopment of the site, but you have to work around that. The electrical interconnection costs are pretty high, and I'll talk a little more about that. Environmental liability for potential contamination is definitely an issue when you're working with a developer. You want to make sure that that they are not liable for that potential contamination. Demolition and remediation costs are really important. And like I mentioned, $38 million is a lot of a large investment to get that site to be completely clean slate. So that really fed into our potential reuse alternatives. And then medium to high investment costs are necessary to redevelop no matter what. So now I'll talk about the alternatives that we looked at and evaluated. Excuse me. We first started with looking at the power plant repowering. You know, we wouldn't be doing our job if we didn't look at this option. You know, unfortunately, the repowering was supposed to happen, but unfortunately, because of the high costs for interconnection, that obviously wasn't a possibility. So this option looked at repowering the NRG power plants from a fuel source of coal to natural gas. We also looked at offshore wind. You know, that's an opportunity. If the state were to move forward with some kind of offshore wind, there needs to be a connection. The infrastructure is here. And if that were to happen, you know, again, we wouldn't be doing our job if we didn't look at that option. We also looked at the option of creating a microgrid, which includes the creation of the ability to disconnect from a larger power grid source, which could potentially power with solar, wind, battery storage, and be locally utilized. Number 5 was industrial development, which I'll get into a little deeper shortly. We also looked at the potential as a data center, which would be a reuse that has the ability to process and host large quantities of data. And lastly, battery storage, which involves the reuse of the site to facilitate the storage of renewable energy and would support the push from New York State to become less reliant on carbon producing energy sources. And then kind of hand in hand with each of these, we looked at the fly ash landfill, landfill methane gas options, biomass, and solar as carbon offsets to any alternatives. And I think I skipped over clean slate, but clean slate meant totally demoing the site, cleaning up any contaminants, and including any type of mixed use development, housing, or park space. So determining how feasible these alternatives were, we kind of divided them up and into 3 different categories: alternatives that we dismissed from further evaluation, the feasible alternatives with challenges, alternatives with the greatest reuse potential. And then the criteria that we used for determining those type of evaluations included job creation. Was the project, was the reuse going to create jobs, tax revenue, the feasibility of that project happening, investment costs that it would take to actually make the project a reality, funding support from the state and other financial organizations, political support for the project on the state, federal, and local levels, and then site cleanup, how much that might cost depending on the different feasible alternatives. So elements that we considered with any of the reuse alternatives, like I said, were the carbon offsets. So using biomass power generation, landfill methane gas from the 5 miles down the road landfill site, solar power generation, whether that be at the NRG landfill site in the town of Pomfret or at the NRG site, and then fly ash kind of energy to be utilized and harvested from the current NRG landfill site in the town of Pomfret. So these are the alternatives that were dismissed from further evaluation, and I'll kind of quickly go over those. Power plant repowering. Ultimately, we looked at our criteria. Job creation, we all know that it would create jobs. Tax revenue, yes, but the feasibility is low because of that interconnection and the cost that's really hindering that feasibility. And then the low political support at the state level, really pushing for the renewable energy at the state level. Investment costs, like I said, really high due to interconnection. Funding support would most likely through state agencies be low. Political support on the state side would be low. And then site cleanup would be low as well. Offshore wind was also dismissed from further analysis. From the local side of things, in 2020 and 2019, we heard from locally that it wasn't as supported, but again, a big piece that came into play is the high investment costs and low employment opportunities. So again, low on the job creation side, tax revenue side, feasibility side. Investment costs would be high, funding support low, political support low, and site cleanup costs at the medium level. Then we looked at microgrid developments as well, and the evaluation criteria for that. Really, that's the distribution of power directly to customers that bypasses the typical power distribution grid. The power supply can be through renewable sources as well. Really, for consideration, we saw a lack of government support, financial feasibility is uncertain, and the compelling energy issue in Dunkirk isn't as large as you'd like to see if you were looking at a microgrid development. And again, low on job creation, tax revenue, feasibility, investment costs would definitely be high. Funding support, political support, low, and site cleanup at a medium level. So these next alternatives were alternatives with challenges, that clean slate. So looking at a clean slate, we looked at what it would cost to demo the existing structures and the site remediation to facilitate a range of development options such as public open space, housing development, mixed use developments, and development presents an opportunity to create creative and unconventional site reuse. That's definitely true. You can see the picture of City of Buffalo and the Harbor Center, or I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the name right now, but they've done some really unique things with different industrial sites throughout the City of Buffalo. But we had to consider what that means for the site. Like we stated, there's a high site prep cost. So whoever would come into the site to redevelop in regards to mixed use, creative housing and park space would have to first incur $38 million, which would really be hard to recoup for future developments. Again, the switch yard is also a challenge for that type of redevelopment option. Implementation will likely require a public-private partnership, and then higher level of environmental cleanup would be required for the site end use. So again, putting housing on the sites might not even be feasible. We need to move forward with a phase 2 environmental site assessment to really gauge what kind of contaminants are on the site. And if certain contaminants are present, then that housing development just wouldn't be an option for the site. So the feasibility is at a medium. Tax revenue, you'd probably see at a medium level. Job creation, medium level, as far as construction, creation of jobs, mixed use potential. But the investment cost is very high. Site cleanup cost is very high. Funding support and political support, you'd probably see medium in regards to that. So it's a challenge, but it could be a possibility. But again, not our highest preferred reuse alternative. So these are the alternatives with greatest feasibility that we saw. Industrial development is a potential. So the use of the site as a distribution or logistics center or industrial business park, which could include some light manufacturing, research and development, or professional offices. You could also look at potential for workforce development, training opportunities in high-tech industries in partnership with SUNY Fredonia or Jamestown Community College. And again, this rated job creation high. Tax revenues, you'd probably do some incentives for getting that type of development to the site. So maybe at first the tax revenue might be on the lower side, but eventually over time that would improve. The feasibility of the project is much higher and investment costs is much higher. Funding support might be on the lower side, but political support would be high and site cleanup would be at the medium level. So lower site environmental remediation costs would be much lower compared to other alternatives that we looked at, because you might be able to use the existing infrastructure, might be able to utilize some of the existing buildings. It most likely require a purchase/investment by a private entity. Waterside infrastructure could be supported by the Army Corps of Engineers funding, if possibly. Some options included that type of development, industrial development. And then developers could potentially utilize incentive programs such as New York State Brownfield Cleanup Program and federal opportunity zones. A data center is also a feasible preferred reuse alternative that we looked at, which includes a network of computer servers used by organizations for remote storage, processing, and distribution of large amounts of data. The former power plant sites are highly equipped with necessary infrastructure, and we've seen this in a lot of case studies throughout the US. The development could be paired with renewable energy resources or battery storage facilities. And again, job creation for this wouldn't be very high, but tax revenue would most likely be high. The feasibility of the project happening is high. Investment costs would be high. Funding support, you might not see as much funding support from state agencies, but that could be coupled with other things such as renewables, which could gain funding support. Political support would most likely be medium, and site cleanup wouldn't be as costly because you're most likely utilizing that current infrastructure and current existing structures on the site. Next, we have battery storage facilities, which again are development of the sites would support the construction and utilization of a battery storage facility of approximately 80 megawatts. We need to dive in deeper with that number and what that would include, but that's a current estimate we have. They could potentially be housed in the existing site facilities or new construction. And then the feasibility is increased if the reuse scenario includes on-site renewable power generation, such as solar, or a short connection to some kind of solar facility, solar development. So again, job creation, not as high here, but tax revenue would be medium. The feasibility of the project is pretty high. Investment costs would be medium because, again, reusing the facilities and infrastructure. Funding support would most likely be really high. We probably could be utilizing funding through different state agencies such as NYSERDA. Political support would most likely be pretty well supported, as well as site cleanup. So as I stated kind of throughout the presentation, I mentioned the NRG landfill sites and the Don Frame landfill sites, which are in the town of Pomfret, approximately 5 miles down the road. We wanted to assess opportunity to leverage those landfill sites and the potential to incorporate renewable energy components at those sites. So there's that potential. And then couple that with a couple different preferred reuse options. So this isn't stating that a data center alone has to be looked at, but there's potential for maybe industrial use coupled with data center, coupled with some battery storage, really. The second reuse looks at the existing facilities or new construction of an industrial park or business park or data logistics facility, which may or may not include a data center component. You could look at the installation of a solar array, potential for installation of battery storage facility, the integration of a waterfront trail connection with public access points as part of the final design plan. So that's one piece that I hadn't mentioned yet, but there's obviously, the City of Dunkirk's got a beautiful waterfront trail that basically is a part of the whole entire City of Dunkirk, except when you get to just the PowerPoint site, the power plant site has that disconnect. So if plans were established with someone that would redevelop at the sites as far as industrial or data center use, we'd hope to work with them as far as incorporating some kind of connection waterfront trail. And then pairing it with the NRG Don Frame landfill sites, there's the use of potential fly ash, the potential installation of a solar array, and the potential development of battery storage facilities. So again, this is high level. This is looking up and coming up with some preferred reuse concepts, but there's a lot of unknowns still, and we need to further explore that and further develop that. So immediate next steps that came out of the phase 1 study included the necessary needs to detail facilities and site infrastructure assessments. We really need to investigate electrical interconnection costs as far as what it would cost for the preferred reuses. Look at further energy modeling as far as renewable energy and what that scale should be. Continued collaboration with NRG, because ultimately NRG is the owner of the site. It's really important that we're collaborating with them. They were one of our stakeholders in the phase 1 study and will continue to be a stakeholder throughout the process of the phase 2 study. And then we need to acquire funding for subsequent studies and assessments, which I'm happy to note we have done and will be moving forward with the phase 2 study. So in coordination with the City of Dunkirk, the CRITIC Chautauqua Regional Economic Development Corporation, which is a nonprofit of the IDA, put in an application through NYSERDA's Just Transition Site Reuse Planning Program. And that's designated to provide communities with planning services to inform future decision-making at the local level and help mitigate any negative impacts or pending or future fossil fuels and power plant closures. And we were successfully awarded $160,000 to move forward with that phase 2 study. And that includes pre-development activities that were not able to be further explored in that baseline phase 1 study. And so this phase 2 study will include that detailed infrastructure assessment that I said we really needed. It also includes legal consultation, what NRG is liable for as far as cleanup, as well as what a future owner operator might be liable for. So that's really important for us to understand. So we thought we needed to include legal consultation, site planning, further site concept designs and what that might look like. Financial analysis, how much the preferred reuse alternatives might cost. Marketing materials, being able to take all of this information that we've compiled and that we've pulled together and being able to market that to developers. So ultimately we'll be developing some possible materials such as a website, materials such as pamphlets and documents that we can be sending out to developers to really gauge interest in the site. And then it's really important that throughout this process, we'll include some tailored public engagement, some community meetings. We'll also look at workforce development and community revitalization strategies, a part of that study. So we're currently finalizing our scope of work for what that phase 2 study should be with NYSERDA as our funder, and we'll start the phase 2 study in April of 2022. And that's where we're at. I'll stop sharing my screen and then.
I think we have a lot of people here really anxious to ask some questions. You said something in the chat, Judy. Why don't you ask a question here?
I have several questions, Rebecca. I'm sorry.
Sure. No,
My
that's fine.
first one is, how much does the NRG have to pay?
Well, that's what we need. Yeah.
Aren't they responsible? I mean,
as owners, yes, and that's what we
Yeah.
need to understand. That's why in phase 2 of our study, we're including legal help to help the city and the county understand what they're liable for and what the state will be holding them responsible for. So yeah, we don't know that.
Is making tons of profit. And so
Oh,
I just looked it up and they made, and I'm wondering, why isn't it their responsibility to do it all? I mean, you said 38 million. Why should we have to pay anything? If they, you know what I mean? Anyway, that's my, one of my big questions. My second one is, I'm very concerned that there's no one from the environmental on the steering committee. For instance, like that data bank that's being proposed, absolutely not. It does so much harm to the lakes but there's no one from the environmental that would have brought that up, and so I would really highly encourage to have someone from the environmental, on there. Because the environmental concerns, I didn't really see a lot of that. And then the chemicals that you say are there, are they affecting people that live there now?
I'm unaware of that. I don't know that.
That might be something that we want to study right away, because all the people that are living there, if they're really fly ash, what use could you do with fly ash? I mean, we had someone that was in the lake that was very, very much against fly ash, and she paid out of her own pocket for the studies to show the cancer, connection. Anyway, I know that those are a ton of questions, but That's a very special part of the city. You know, I know my husband grew up there at the point. It's a very, and I'm very concerned about what's going, what's going to go on there. And I certainly wouldn't want to see something come in that's going to hurt our lake. And secondly, I mean, seriously, this company is making a ton of money. And yet we have to come up with $38 million to clean up their mess.
Those are just estimates. I don't think that any cost has been attributed to any specific party at this point, but we need to know what the costs are.
Well, shouldn't it be 100?
Excuse me?
Shouldn't it be 100%?
Well, we need to know what the costs are before, the
But I
cost
meant the
estimate-
responsibility for NRG, no matter what the cost is.
That part hasn't been, that's still, as Rebecca said, being studied in terms of all the legal implications. So, assigning who is liable for what is what this phase 2 is basically going to investigate.
Usually we have a round of applause after a speaker, and that was an excellent presentation. So Rebecca,
Thank you.
it was just excellent, so easy to follow.
Thank you. I think it's really important to know, just speaking on what NRG is liable for as terms of cost. We don't know that yet because we haven't moved forward with a developer that is officially interested in the site and understanding what that developer might have to be responsible for, what NRG might be responsible for. But ultimately, if we weren't moving forward with these types of studies, NRG would just be sitting on the site and nothing would be happening. So it's really important that we're keeping NRG at the table and engaged and a part of this process to make sure that when we do start talking about, okay, we have a potential developer for the site, that we have not only NRG, but we have our understanding of the law and what they're responsible for. And we have our different state agencies at the table as well, holding them accountable for it, and also helping out with the costs to actually move a project forward. So it's really important. There's a lot of pieces and a lot of moving parts to this. And yes, ultimately, I wish we could hold NRG responsible for cleaning it up tomorrow. But they ultimately are the owners and could just sit on it and do nothing. So this is, the proactive approach that I think the mayor has really taken and pushed for, and the county, we're here to support and help through that process too.
Thank you. Marcia, you have your hand up.
Okay, I was concerned when you said that NRG hasn't released all the chemicals or environmental, there are things missing in terms of the chemicals. I mean, do they have to eventually release all that information? It seems crazy to me that they haven't, well, it could be much worse than we think, because they wouldn't be hiding it if it was much better, clearly.
Have they done an analysis yet to see what chemicals are there?
Well, I'm saying that they haven't, she said. I
Yeah,
believe-
right. No, I'm with you. I'm just, Rebecca, have they analyzed to see what potential toxins might be present?
So I don't know if they've privately done that, but ultimately what we were able to pull is only public data. So that's why we have some gaps, because there might be some privately held data that we just don't have access to yet. But we're hoping with this phase 2 approach, we can work together a little more and receive all the information we're looking for.
As long as you don't have residential, I think I heard you say that as long as you don't have residential buildings going up, that's not really a big deal, because you wouldn't be digging up and bringing those toxins up from the soil. Did I get that right?
Yeah, you most likely.
And it's the level of cleanup that would be necessary once whatever type of contamination is identified. And could it be ever cleaned up to the level where you can allow residential use?
And I tell you, they use, NRG paid for low sulfur coal. They paid for transportation from the Midwest. Instead of getting cheap sulfur high coal. They paid extra for low sulfur coal. So what I'm trying to get at is I don't think there should be a lot of toxins there to begin with.
Okay, we have a question. Why isn't impact on the lake included in the criteria? Cooling a data center can cause enormous overheating of lake and killing of fish. Is there anybody that could address that concern?
I think that's a great point to point out and something that we'll include in our phase 2 study when we do a deeper dive. Again, this was high level, throwing out ideas, but ultimately this next phase will really dig deeper, look at those pieces. I'll including it in my notes right now to make sure it's a component of the phase 2 study.
There was another comment related to that. I agree, the health of our lake and the environment around that water, and the fact that we get our drinking water from the lake makes it continue protection a high priority. So that's another. I had a question. When you are referring to the use of the let me see, data center. You're not talking about Bitcoin manufacturing, are you?
Yes.
Absolutely. I got a family member who's a millionaire that looked to buy that building for that very purpose.
Bitcoin mining.
Yeah, and you need a lot of cooling, and you just need a lot of space to put all these computers. But he decided against it. I don't know. I didn't ask him why.
Okay, has there been any investigation into other places like Plattsburgh where, the Bitcoin manufacturing took place?
Yes, there has.
Is that part of the phase 2?
Finger Lakes.
Yeah, I think Bitcoin is definitely a potential
Okay,
that we're going to be looking into.
okay.
Who on the committee is the environmental person?
Our consultants and DC will probably be at the table. We'll
Why
be
don't we
having a
have
lot of.
Can we have someone local? A local environmentalist? I mean, we have all these other local, representatives, which is great. I think that that's what we need, is to have more local. But I think a lot of people have done a lot of work here. Like I know on the fly ash, they absolutely, have a lot of data on that. But also about this data center. I mean, there's people that are up on these environmental things that might bring things that people aren't aware of. Like if the data center was presented right away, someone that was environmental would say, wait a minute, this is the potential that it would destroy our lake.
I think we're getting a little far ahead of ourselves. With phase 1 was just basically identifying
Okay.
future possible uses.
But my
and
question is,
that's
who's
we're going.
representing the environment? Or could you reach out and try to find someone that would be like,
Yeah.
an environmental person on the steering committee? I mean, we have the job development people, which are all important, but I think that an important component is the environment.
Mhm.
And like the woman said, we get our drinking water from the lake. We want to really get it right. Or at least I do for future generations, but.
Definitely. Yep.
Okay, any other, Marcia, do you want to put your hand down or do you have another question? Okay, I don't see any other questions in the chat. You can, raise your hand or something if you feel like, yes, Roger.
Cedar Beach, to me, is tremendously underutilized. It's you go swimming at the point, it's all rocks. This is, a lot of people go to Wright Beach because that's nice and sandy and much more user-friendly. And Cedar Beach, I would like to see come back. I called up City Hall and said, who owns the beacon out there? And I guess NRG owns right up to it, but the Coast Guard does. Now, does the mayor know the city owns Cedar Beach right up to the fence that's outside the NRG? Is that correct?
I believe it is, yes.
Okay, well, I don't know how many of you know it, but there's a sandbar off Wright Beach East. It's unbelievable. If you go like 50 feet offshore, it's 2.5 feet deep. Next time on a windy day, drive down Lakeshore Boulevard and you'll notice the first set of waves starts about 50 feet out. All right. So I want to dig up that sand on that sandbar and move it to Cedar Beach. And make a beautiful sand beach on Cedar Beach. My mother said when she was a kid, you had to get there by noon or there'd be no place to put your towel down. It was wall-to-wall people in the 30s at Cedar Beach.
Mhm.
And the Historical Society of Dunkirk has got a great picture of men with tops. You know, that was 1920s when the men had to cover up the top too. Swimming off the base of the, I kept calling it the lighthouse. Diane Andrasic got me right on that. It's called the Beacon. Okay. But in any event, that was a large part of my youth. And Cedar Beach is such a beautiful beach if it were cleaned up. It just needs some more sand. And you know, that sandbar out there is a danger for when you have the speedboat races. I mean, it's just I took a cousin out there and he just couldn't believe it. I mean, it's like 2.5 feet deep out there with beautiful sand. And so, well, I'm talking too long. You got the message.
I'm sorry, I didn't bring up a point that was made earlier. Cummins is exploring hydrogen electrolysis and the development of hydrogen engines. NYSERDA has a hydrogen electrolysis development interest. Given Cummins' place in our community already, might this be something to consider and pursue? And to what extent will NRG participate in any efforts? Is that an answer that can that be addressed?
Can I just mention that we have to remember that that is private property owned by NRG, which is a multi-billion-dollar corporation.
Mhm.
They, if we don't play nice with them, they can play hardball, and in the end, we won't get what we want. So, at this point, what we're trying to do is keep them at the table, work and play nice with them to make sure that if the opportunity comes to surface to redevelop in there, that they are willing to allow that development to happen. If they choose not to, as Rebecca stated, they can sit on that property and just pay their taxes. And as long as there's no ordinances or violations or anything like that, there's really nothing that we can do.
Would you agree that they want to sell it fast?
I don't even know that they want to sell it, because ultimately I believe that they would still be holding a liability and responsible for the cleanup.
Oh,
So that's why we have to make it lucrative for them to be able to get out of the way.
has the EPA done any study with respects to a toxic site?
So,
Rebecca?
So ultimately, this phase 2 study is funded through NYSERDA, and that's the difference between our phase 1 study and our phase 2. Our funding source is through a state agency that's going to bring other state agencies to the table and working together to possibly, come up with a game plan to move forward with the redevelopment option. And the EPA will probably be at the table, all of these players that you're talking about. So yeah, I just wanted to make mention of that.
I'd like to make mention of the fact that we all should remember that NRG paid over 50% of the taxes decade after decade after decade. We owe NRG a great big kissy poo, in my opinion. I think they've always been very good corporate neighbors. And so we should be appreciative. I was even thinking of submitting a NRG Appreciation Day to the mayor.
What?
Because I'm telling you, they just look how they kept the taxes down for what, 50, 60 years? And they have been always supportive for all of community efforts and so forth. So NRG's been great. They tried to switch it to methane. They poured $200 million into it to get the electrostatic removal of the smoke. And then they had a switch from coal to methane. And then right in the middle of that, it gets scuttled because of rehooking up to the 114 million to rehook up to the grid. So they certainly have always been nice to the city of Dunkirk, in my opinion. I think we ought to be nice back.
Well, it sounds like you're blackmailing us to
I
me.
have a
Blackmailing them?
question.
Blackmailing them by thanking them for all the years of support.
I
Well,
have
I'm
a
saying, Judy,
question.
let me finish,
One at
please.
a time.
Well, you butted in more. I was asking a question. My question is this: if we can't hold NRG liable, what laws do we need to change so in the future we could hold whatever energy is coming in that could hurt our community liable?
We're not saying that we can't hold NRG liable. We need to
Oh.
understand what they're liable for. We don't understand that yet. And that's what the phase 2 study will help us through.
Oh, okay. So we don't know that they could be, helping us out a lot in this.
Right.
They
I
can
mean,
find out.
ultimately, maybe it's something that we get a developer to the table, we get NRG to the table. What's NRG going to contribute? What's the developer going to bring? What are state agencies going to bring for funding for making this an opportunity to redevelop the site? There's
I
a lot of
forget-
moving parts.
I just asked that question, Rebecca, because every time I go to any meeting about any alternative, that's one of the first things. What are they going to do with those wind blades when the windmills can't run anymore? What are they going to do? And so if I'm thinking, I want to be able to, say, well, I don't know whether we need to change laws in the state to say that they will be 100% responsible, or if we have good enough laws.
Well,
And I
we-
know.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, we usually go for an hour, unless there are any really burning questions. I would love to thank you, the 3 people involved here. Thank you, Mayor Rosas, for joining in, and Vince DeJoy and Rebecca Worcester. And it was an excellent presentation. I really appreciate it. Well done.
Very informative.
Yes.
Very-
Okay, Nancy, quick question. Oh, you're just clapping. Oh, okay.
Thanks for having us.
Alrighty.
Thank you for coming and doing that.